Right now, whatever you're wearing, there's a good chance it started as a small white puff growing out of a plant that looks almost too fragile to matter. But that plant didn't just clothe the world, it built fortunes so large they're still hard to comprehend. It powered the Industrial Revolution. It became the single biggest reason for the forced enslavement of millions of human beings. And it started a war that killed more Americans than any conflict in the country's history. All from a soft white fiber that most of us have never once stopped to think about. The story starts thousands of years before any of that, in the river valleys of the Indus, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Around 5,000 years ago, people there were already growing cotton, spinning it into thread, and weaving it into cloth, making it one of the oldest textile technologies on Earth. Cotton was also independently domesticated in Mesoamerica and in parts of Africa, meaning humans in multiple corners of the world separately looked at this fluffy little plant and realized the same thing. This could be turned into fabric, unlike anything else available. And that fabric was extraordinary. Unlike wool, cotton didn't itch. Unlike linen, it was soft against the skin, it could be dyed in brilliant colors, it breathed in the heat, and it could be woven into cloth so fine that European travelers who first encountered Indian muslin centuries later genuinely struggled to believe it was made by human hands rather than something closer to magic. For most of history, India was the center of the cotton universe. Indian weavers had spent centuries perfecting techniques that nobody else in the world could match. By the time European trading ships began arriving in the 1600s, Indian cotton textiles weren't just goods, they were among the most desired luxury products on the planet, shipped to markets across Asia, Africa, and eventually Europe. And that's where the trouble started. European trading companies, especially the British East India Company, noticed something happening in their own economies. Money was flowing out to India to pay for cotton cloth, and very little was flowing back. Local wool and linen industries in England were struggling to compete with fabric that was simply better. So European governments did what struggling industries have done throughout history when they can't outcompete a rival. They tried to legislate it out of existence. England passed laws in the late 1600s and early 1700s specifically banning the import of many Indian cotton textiles, all to protect domestic wool producers. But you can't legislate away demand. People still wanted cotton. They just needed someone else to make it. And that single unmet demand quietly set the stage for one of the most transformative and devastating chapters in human history. Britain didn't have the climate to grow cotton at home, so British merchants and manufacturers turned their attention to a place with a warm climate, plenty of land, and, from their entirely amoral, profit-driven point of view, an existing system they could exploit to supply endless cheap labor, the Americas. By the 1700s, cotton plantations were spreading across the southern colonies of what would become the United States, along with similar operations across the Caribbean and Brazil. And these plantations ran almost entirely on the forced labor of enslaved Africans, torn from their homes and shipped across the Atlantic in the horrific conditions of the transatlantic slave trade. For decades, cotton production remained limited by one brutal, tedious bottleneck. Removing the sticky green seeds from raw cotton fiber by hand was painfully slow work. One person could clean only about a pound of cotton a day. Then, in 1793, an American inventor named Eli Whitney built a simple mechanical device called the cotton gin. You'd think a machine that removed seeds faster would have made life easier for everyone involved. It actually made things immeasurably worse. The cotton gin allowed a single worker to clean 50 times more cotton per day than before. Suddenly, cotton wasn't just profitable, it was staggeringly profitable, and the demand for enslaved labor to plant and pick that cotton exploded rather than shrank. Historians estimate that in the decades following the invention of the cotton gin, the enslaved population in the American South grew dramatically, driven almost entirely by the economics of cotton. By the mid-1800s, cotton grown by enslaved people in the American South supplied roughly 3/4 of the world's cotton, feeding the textile mills of Britain and fueling an economic engine so massive that cotton alone made up more than half of all American exports. Southern planters and British industrialists both grew extraordinarily wealthy. Enslaved people received none of that wealth, only unimaginable suffering, and that engine was about to collide head-on with the moral and political fractures of a nation. By 1860, the economics of cotton had become so tightly bound to slavery that Southern political and economic elites were unwilling to imagine a future without it. When the United States finally went to war with itself in 1861, cotton sat at the very center of the conflict, an entire regional economy built on human bondage, refusing to let go of the crop that had made it rich. The American Civil War killed more soldiers than any war in American history, and underneath the political speeches and battlefield strategies sat quite literally a plant. Meanwhile, across the ocean, cotton was reshaping Britain just as dramatically, though through a different kind of transformation. In Manchester and the surrounding region, cotton mills multiplied at a staggering rate, powered first by water wheels and then by coal-fired steam engines. This wasn't just an industry, it became the engine of the entire industrial revolution. Manchester earned the nickname Cottonopolis, and by the early 1800s, cotton textiles accounted for a huge share of Britain's total exports. But that industrial miracle came with its own brutal human cost. Conditions inside cotton mills were often horrifying. Workers, including large numbers of children as young as 5 or 6, labored 12 to 14 hours a day in deafeningly loud rooms filled with cotton dust that scarred their lungs. Industrial accidents were common and often gruesome, since exhausted workers operated fast-moving machinery with almost no safety protections. So cotton had, by the mid-1800s, built two intertwined systems of human suffering on opposite sides of the Atlantic: enslaved labor in American fields and dangerous, exploitative factory labor in British mills. The soft white fiber connecting them both sat quietly at the center of some of the darkest chapters of the modern era. When the Civil War finally cut off the supply of Southern cotton to British mills in the early 1860s, it triggered what became known as the Cotton Famine, throwing hundreds of thousands of British mill workers into unemployment and forcing Britain to scramble for new cotton sources in Egypt and India. That scramble reshaped colonial policy across entire continents. British administrators pushed harder to expand cotton cultivation in India, the very place cotton textiles had originated from centuries earlier, except now India was being pressured to grow raw cotton for export to British mills rather than to weave it into the fine textiles it had once been famous for. It's a strange twist of history. The birthplace of cotton cloth was turned into a raw material supplier for the very industry that had once tried to ban its finished products. After the Civil War ended in 1865 and slavery was formally abolished in the United States, cotton didn't disappear from the American South. It simply found a new, more disguised form of exploitation. Sharecropping systems trapped many formerly enslaved people and their descendants in cycles of debt and dependency that, in practice, echoed the economic bondage of the world they had supposedly left behind, a pattern that persisted for generations. Cotton kept transforming through the 20th century. Mechanical cotton pickers, developed and refined through the early and mid-1900s, eventually replaced the vast human labor force the crop had always depended on, permanently reshaping rural economies and accelerating the migration of millions of Black Americans out of the South in search of new opportunities, a movement historians call the Great Migration. Today, cotton is grown across more than 80 countries, and it remains one of the most widely used natural fibers on the planet, found in roughly a third of all textiles produced worldwide. But its story is still not free of controversy. Modern cotton farming is heavily water-intensive, and certain regions, most notably around the Aral Sea in Central Asia, have suffered catastrophic environmental collapse after decades of aggressive irrigation for cotton cultivation. Reports of forced and coerced labor tied to cotton production have also surfaced in various parts of the world in recent years, a haunting reminder that the crop's long relationship with exploitation never fully vanished. It simply kept adapting to new eras. So the next time you pull on a plain cotton t-shirt without a second thought, remember what you're actually touching. You're touching the same plant that clothed ancient civilizations in fabric so fine it seemed impossible, the same plant that powered the factories of the Industrial Revolution while children worked themselves to exhaustion inside them, the same plant that fueled the forced enslavement of millions of people, and the same plant whose economics helped drag an entire nation into its bloodiest war. A small, soft, unassuming fiber, and one of the most quietly powerful forces that ever shaped the modern world.